great to be here. I'll stand here. Can you see me? And can you hear me? LafargeHolcim is the first time I've come to this event, and I'm immediately jealous. I organize events around the world on urban issues, but I think the interdisciplinary nature of the discussion you've had this morning and will continue to have in this particular city is really of great significance. It's interesting to hear that, this morning we went from Keller's extraordinary deep analysis of effectively the politics behind infrastructure to Hank's linking the environmental with the social to this very informative discussion about what lies behind the economics of infrastructure. I want to try and take some of these issues and talk about the social impacts. But as we've heard in the last few hours, there's a tendency to be pretty negative when it comes to talking about infrastructure. And I called my talk the Infrastructures of Inequality, and I've rebranded myself. I thought I should be positive. So I'm going to talk about infrastructures of integration. Because if we think of all the three things that have been talked about up until now, there's a flip side to the coin. You can actually invest in infrastructure to do things better. And I think that's what we're here to learn. Hank's call for a sort of different way of thinking politics, effectively, in order to solve the problem so that the way that money is spent actually is used in a positive way is really what we should be thinking about. And I want to do this at two levels. I want to talk about big picture infrastructure as an urbanist, looking at maps like these. Some of you in the room, probably unfortunately, know exactly what a PTAL map is. Public Transport Accessibility Level. Others happily don't. And I'll try and connect that issue to this issue. That when we talk about infrastructure at this very large scale as we have today, and we will continue to in the next 2 days, the effect it actually has on three individuals like these, father and two kids being taken to school in Bogota, is absolutely what we're talking about. It's about saving the planet, yes, it's about better equity, but it's about making a better quality of life. What this map shows, and I'm going to come back to it, is very simply in purple where you can get to everywhere else in London in less than an hour through public transport, and in blue where you have a deficiency of access, which is the suburbs where it takes over 2 hours. Every city has a map like that. The question is what is the social impact and what do we do about it? I'm also going to talk very briefly about ways of thinking infrastructure, and this is through Norman Foster's work, which is ongoing at the moment, in fact supported by the LafargeHolcim Foundation. I'll talk about that in a second, of how you can deal with some of the extraordinary things Carlos was talking about in terms of actually using, let's call it not this neutral territory, but new territory of investment in ways of taking technologies of the moment and perhaps using drones, drone ports, and other forms of infrastructure to take Africa more quickly to where it should be. Rather than this, yes, it may have very good cement, it may be even green cement, if we can call it that, but the invasive impact of the bus rapid transit system in Rio, which is being done for the Olympics, is going to have a cost on the social equity of that city for years to come. Now, I'm reminded, in fact was reminded by Norman Foster, of the link, the close link, which at LafargeHolcim you've been talking about for years now, between high-quality design and urban infrastructure, even at this level. This is an extraordinary picture of an extraordinary project. It's from 1850s. It's by Frederick Law Olmsted and others, even with a misspelling, sorry there. And what this is about is creating, of course, a green lung to a city which, of course, was growing at the time. But it's a green lung which was designed with extraordinary attention to the architecture, the infrastructure, the engineering, in such a way that you can cross it without actually knowing that you're going from one side of this extraordinary city to the other. So the fact that infrastructure need not be invasive or exclusive is really what I want to talk about. We could be talking about, and we have this morning, talked about infrastructure in many, many ways. This is at least 15 or 20 ways of talking about it. I think the most important thing which is happening at this conference and in the discourse out there, that we're all trying to get out of our little boxes and not just talk about sewers, not just talk about architecture, not just talk about engineering or schools or water, as we heard, but how these actually interconnect, and I'll come back to that. And I think we shouldn't throw away what generations of architects and planners, engineers, thought about in the 1920s and 30s when they were trying to solve the problems that we are trying to solve at that time. When Korb and colleagues thought about the Plan Voisin, it was all about dealing with the issues of health. There are many negative associations. We saw in Keller's extraordinary images a sort of horrifying version of this world of the modernist Charter of Athens model that we see here. But the fundamental concept was the right one. Get rid of the horrible density, which created lack of air, cholera, and diseases, unfortunately in rather beautiful Paris, but was an issue. Get rid of that, build towers which are cruciform, put a park beneath them, and allow fresh air to go through all the windows. It's a strong idea. It just has had many negative consequences on the way people have been able to interact or not interact, or create community and many other things. That's what we need to understand. And we need to understand that, and of course the last talk has made this clearer than anyone else could make. We need to understand that in parts of the world which are urbanizing, requiring more and more investment in infrastructure in the years to come and not only in the past. What you see here in yellow, even though you can not see it very clearly because of the focus, what you see in yellow is where the UN, over the next 20 years, projects there will be greater urbanization. And of course, we've heard about Africa. In green, in fact, you see where urban growth and infrastructure investment has happened since the Second World War, roughly since the 50s onwards, and in light green in the last 20, 30 years. The yellow, as you well know, is concentrated in this part of the world, and partly in China. Now, the statistics just quoted say this even more strongly. You can't read it from the back of the room, but the top 10, 15 cities, which are growing faster, but much faster than cities that we think of in China or in other parts of Latin America, are Nairobi, Lagos, Kinshasa, Kabul, Addis Ababa, and so it goes on. These are cities that, at least today, are in regions of the world which are relatively low income, we heard what is actually happening there, and relatively low energy. So the question is here, and I think this goes to Keller's point, what model do we follow, and what are the consequences? And let's remind ourselves, and I know that Julia King will be speaking about this, and others will be talking about this later in this conference over the next few days, that one has to deal with this problem as well as the more sophisticated problem we all understand, the more visible problem. There's an invisible problem. Think that every one of you, every three of you, look left and look right, will be living in the yellow parts of the maps that we saw a moment ago, and will be living in some condition of a slum. I don't like that term, many of us don't like that term, it's too heavy, but it basically means absence of infrastructure as we understand it. Not just sewers, schools, housing, and other forms of well-being, So understanding what the conditions are here, you have in the project that Eric Olson referred to at the beginning this morning, obviously understand this, but one has to understand how to deal with this level of infrastructure at one case, but also at the much bigger areas that I'm going to be talking about. Now, I just want to show a couple of graphs to make one general point, which I hope is helpful to effectively the discussions which will continue over the days. This is some work we did at the London School of Economics, which takes around 350 cities around the world. All you need to see is the horizontal axis is basically, as you come closer to the right-hand side, better human development according to the UN HDI. Basically, that means you live longer, better education, and better income if you're on the right-hand side. And the vertical axis is the energy footprint, more or less, we have. Now, you can't see, because of the slides, that the colors show you that down here, which is Africa, on the whole, you have today lower Human Development Index, but it's obviously moving upwards. You have South Africa here. You have China somewhere in this area. You have most of Europe over here and the United States up here. Now, you might say, okay, that's great. It's not great. It's not great when you take into account that in order to live within our means, if that's what we're hoping to do, that is what one Earth actually sustains. Now, we know we're not going to live within one Earth. What Henk was saying was very salutary. Certain problems are going to be there. The question is actually how to deal with them with an intelligent way. And even though we are hosts of the United States of America, there have been a few hits at this country, this very generous country, already this morning. The United States model requires 5 Earths to actually support. And the discussion of sustainability, which is so prominent here, is all about how does one increase human well-being, but also reduce the energy footprint per person. Now, at the heart of this, and this is one of the key points, of course, I want to make in my contribution to the discussion, is the relationship between physical form, public transport, infrastructure, and sustainability. We've done a lot of work at the LSE in literally mapping different cities. The gray part, very obvious, well-known mechanism to show where cities have extended, how far they've extended, and in some cases, as in African cities, Asian cities, grown remarkably fast in terms of population, but also dramatically wide in terms of urban sprawl. If you measure these in other ways of taking the statistics of density and show where people actually live, you find that a city like London, a very green city with 8.5 million people, and I'll go back to that later, is a city of extremely low density. I would say dangerously low density. It needs to toughen up and build up to be sustainable in the future. You find cities like Hong Kong, I'll show you examples of that in a moment, which of course are incredibly dense in terms of where people live, with 30, 40-story buildings. But is that what produces density? No, not necessarily. Mumbai, which has buildings with maybe on average 3 or 4 stories high, have 10, 15 people actually living there. Not a sustainable solution socially, but its environmental impact is important to understand. And again, let's remind ourselves that we have choices. Keller made it so clear, it's a policy choice. It's a choice of how much you allow the market to actually decide. Just coming here, we were reminded that 70 years ago you had a tram in Detroit and it was taken away by the car industry because it wasn't, it would be something that would compete. And now you're spending, I don't know how much money in Detroit to put one back. Well, there's the same story. Atlanta and Berlin, roughly 5 million people. Look at the difference in size of the footprint, and one is not surprised that 92% of people in Atlanta use cars to get to work, while in Berlin it's roughly a third. Let's look at 3 cities very quickly to talk about the relationship between physical form and efficiencies in infrastructure before I turn to notions of equity. I'm going to talk about London, which has a pretty sophisticated, expensive, long-term investment in transport now for over 150 years. Let's look at New York, of course, double the density but the same the population as London, with a pretty sophisticated and expensive transport system, but not as well maintained as the London one, I have to say, but it costs much less. And let's take Hong Kong, roughly 7 million people, in roughly a quarter the size of London in terms of the footprint, with an incredibly dense and efficient public transport system. What we've done here as part of our work, difficult to see, but you get the idea, I hope. We've taken on the left-hand side where people live, so the higher the density is not the height of the buildings, but simply how many people live close together, right? So if this room had twice the number of people, the density would be up here, okay? This is where people live on London, and this is where people work in London. So here you have roughly 9 million people, and this is nearly 1 million people coming into the centers of business in London. You need a very, very extensive system very expensive system of infrastructure transport to make this work. And we've done that in our city. This is not affordable elsewhere. This is exactly the same in in Hong Kong, where maybe I then missed New York. There we go, let's go back, sorry. So there is New York with roughly the same population as London, 2 or 3 times the density of where people live. Yes, taller buildings, but people live more closely together. And even more people actually come into New York on a daily basis. And this is Hong Kong, as I alluded to before. Enormous density of residents, but also offices. People live very closely together in 30, 40-story buildings, but also the relative distances people travel are much less. And what does this have to do in terms of the big themes of this conference? The relationship is very much to do with that graph that I showed you before, relating also well-being, productivity, efficiency, and footprint. Because if you take Hong Kong there on the top left, the effect of that physical model of the high density of residents and the high density of work, 93% of the population, 93%, think of any city you all live in, actually use public transport to get to work. That means millionaires, a few billionaires as well, actually use public transport. Why? Because it's absolutely the quickest way of doing that. And look at the other cities, they're different, but what is interesting is that in Hong Kong, average commuting times are less than 15 minutes. In Sao Paulo, Mexico City, average commuting times are over 3.5, 4 hours. And in Sao Paulo, a lot of the elites were used to taking helicopters rather than taking cars to actually be more efficient. Now, all of this relates to an interesting point made before by Carlos about the price of commodities. Up until now, the cost of gasoline, the cost of petrol, and this city becomes even more meaningful to talk about this, have driven this relationship between urban density and actual gasoline consumption per person. So up at the top, you can't see it, you have Houston, then Phoenix, and Detroit, this city. What does this mean? These are cities which are actually incredibly sprawling, and therefore car use or petroleum, gasoline fuel-based vehicles are very dependent on the way people move around. Way at the other end, you have Hong Kong, Tokyo, where something like 80% and more of the population use public transport. These are fundamental political questions that those who make decisions, and those of us who vote for those who make decisions, have to take about the shape of our cities, and absolutely central to any discussion about infrastructure. Keller Eastling's image of King Abdul City, which was the last one, in a place where there is no water, by the way, let alone even though petrol is more or less free, would clearly end up in the wrong place when you come to this graph. Let me move in the final part of my talk to the relationship between infrastructure and social equity in a more direct way. One way of measuring social equity is basically access to education. I think everyone in this room knows that if men, young women don't get education early on in life, nearby, in a safe environment to be able to get there from home, you lose out on many of the benefits that come from that. And some of the work we did was looking at 3 cities. We looked at many more, but just comparing it here to be very concise. We compared Sao Paulo, Istanbul, and Mumbai. So we looked at a city in Latin America, Europe, straddling Asia, and India. Different populations, but all very, very large, from 10 million upwards. Relatively different sort of incomes, and different levels of inequality in them. Without looking in too much detail at the shape of these cities, what actually happens is that the poor, the most unequal members of society in all 3 of these cities, on the whole, are pushed out towards the edges. This is a symptom which is very much part of the late 20th century of what has happened to the dynamics of urban growth. The key point I want to make here is raise the issue of the relationship between transport, sprawl, and access to education as a proxy of talking about integration. And what was fascinating to us is that if you take education levels actually attained by people in different parts of the city, the quality of education, and the higher up you go, basically until you get to high school, is totally and utterly correlated, not only in relation to how close you are to the city center, and therefore its better transport facilities, but also very closely correlated to distance from public transport, or in fast public transport can mean anything from a subway to a bus rapid transit system. So fundamentally for us to remember is that decisions made about whether to invest in one form of public transport, whether to invest in a form of urban development which actually promotes sprawl rather than negates it, has an impact on the way our children and grandchildren are educated. Hence those critical relationships which have been discovered, have been understood by the mayors of Bogota who introduced the bus rapid transit system, but very importantly for this discussion, also placed them close to the cycle networks, the ciclovías, before the informal development happened in that city, and then were used and are being used as we speak today for people like this person to take his kids to school. Now, I wish I had my father cycle me to school. It would have changed the nature of my relationship. But think what effect that has on people who are policemen, who are nurses, or other sort of professions where stress levels are enormously high if you spend 4 or 5 hours commuting a day. So again, I'm trying to bring this bigger issue of infrastructure down to what it means to the individual and to the networks. And the transport policies have also been very closely integrated to the location of public schools, so that Bogota now has the highest literacy rate in the whole of Latin America. Medellin is now so obvious we hardly want to talk about it, particularly here because you've been exposed to that at LafargeHolcim. But what is most important for me in terms of this conversation is that the well-known Teleferico system, taken from effectively Switzerland and brought to Latin America, has been completely connected with schools, libraries, and other places of learning. These are not perfect examples at all, but they're ways of dealing with infrastructure at this sort of macro level of social change. Now, Norman Foster, and it's difficult to see this from where you are, but I'll show you some more images, has been thinking of this issue through the Norman Foster Foundation, where I'm a trustee, and other specialists in the field who are dealing with problems of health in Africa, and tried to deal with this combining notions of inaccessibility of some of the infrastructure and the problems of development and the problems of health and illness. Now, I don't need to go through this in any detail. We've heard so much from Carlos, it's very clear. But that growth is happening in Africa, that population increase is happening at a prodigious rate, we all know. That energy use is also, by definition, going to grow, is important. What he didn't talk about, and is worth sharing, is that there's still today 450,000 deaths from malaria and other diseases that you see there. Most of these diseases, I'm no expert on this, can be addressed if you can get medicine to the individuals quickly, within hours or within days, and that is the issue. Now that's a problem when you have a continent where at the moment, today, only 1/3 live within 2 kilometers of an all-season road. That's what it looks like. So if you have to bring blood, medicine, or anything else from A to B, it can take 3 days more because your car gets stuck. So the idea here is to actually use a new technology, and the technology of drones, to actually create highways in the sky which can take you from A to B. And this is now a real project where teaming up with an existing charity which deals with medical issues in Rwanda, they're setting up different drone ports, which I will describe, designed by Foster and his practice, and taking advantage of sort of networks which you can see here, which are being established. We don't need to go into this. The point is very clear. If instead of having to take a road with a Land Rover, which might get flooded or collapse as you drive over it, you can actually use one of these efficient machines, which are light and can travel very fast. The ability to actually bring medicine more quickly exactly where you need it is fundamental. So Foster has designed, and this is bringing infrastructure down to really a sort of micro level from this macro problem that we've talked about, has designed a shell for these drone ports which could actually be built by local people using natural and local materials, and this is exactly where they're working with the LafargeHolcim Foundation to actually create this. The concept is create something that can be built by anyone that looks like that, 6.5 meters high. You can assemble them together, and this is where the drones land. You can see one sort of up at the top of the hill where medical goods and other goods can be brought. These become hubs themselves in a very Norman Foster way. There it is, it's happened. And even more in the future, you're going to have even more of it. But the key point is, take a very simple form of structure, use a technology which is happening as we speak, make these pieces of urban acupuncture, so to speak, not acupuncture, make places where at the moment there is nothing, make them as simple as you can, and then nearly by definition what will happen is that other things will grow around it. Where people are to receive goods, medications and other things, as you know, in front of a hospital or a health center, anywhere you see that, you can have post offices, clinics. So the structure itself actually becomes the basis of a new form of, in a way, urbanization, depending on healthy forms of travel. This is where LafargeHolcim is, in fact, working with Norman, and they're going to be building in the next few weeks, in fact, 2 months left, in the Venice Biennale, a half-scale prototype of this shell that you see here, which hopefully is going to be implemented throughout Rwanda in the next few months. These are the organizations involved with that. Let me end by, as I suggested, bringing this back to the urban scale. Interestingly, Eric Olson at the beginning talked about the sustainability of the investment made by your company, this company, into the sustainability of the games in a sort of macro, in a very, very precise way, i.e. using more efficient and less polluting concrete and other forms of procuring that and all the structures there. I want to talk about nearly the same project, but at a much larger scale as to what's happened in London in the few minutes that I have left. London, as you've seen, is a wide, dispersed, relatively low-density city. As you can see from this image, many clusters around the edges which are very well connected. And actually, unlike most Western cities or cities of the global north, and this is particularly painful and poignant to say it here in Detroit, what's happened in London is that we've seen an increase in population in the last sort of 10, 15 years, bringing us back, in fact, to the historical high. In fact, only last year, London hit its highest population number that it's ever had, and it's actually grown and will be something like 10 million by 2035. London is not at all a perfect city. For any of you who know it, travel there, let alone try and live there, it's a city which is divided, it's expensive, it has fundamental social problems which are physically translated in the reality of the city. We had a number of years ago some very severe confrontations on the street, and this reflects a very underlying problem which is reflected by some of these statistics. The most important diagram, I want to show you this, and I'll come back to it a few times in the few remaining slides, which takes this issue of inequality, which I stress, every city in the world has it, right? If you did it in Detroit, it would look different from this. If you did it in Paris, it would look different from this. What I've shown here, if that's the River Thames going through the city, in red, the darker red, the most deprived of London. So higher teenage pregnancies, lower life expectancies, higher unemployment. And in green, exactly the other opposite, more affluent, better educated, better income. And basically you can see here, more or less, half close your eyes, that East London on the right is more deprived, with some changes, some differences there, and most of the periphery is actually quite affluent. In Paris, it would be exactly the opposite. This is not one. So this, you could say, is a situation, but it's also a problem that needs to be resolved by planning, investment, and infrastructure. Now, at the LSE, because we're serious academics, there are other ways of describing this thing, but But think of it this way. If you're born today in West London and you take the Underground, the Jubilee line, and go to where the Olympics are in East London, today, as a man, you lose 1 year of life expectancy at every transport stop you take. This is differences which exist between Ho Chi Minh City and Hong Kong, or differences that exist between Buenos Aires and Quito in the Latin American. In our own city, there is this inefficiency. And also, and I showed you this at the very beginning, we have inequality of access to public transport. I said that in purple, you can get access to nearly everywhere else in London through public transport with less than an hour. In red, and this is probably the most important one, there are some pockets. You see them there. There's one over there, there's one over there, one over there. But broadly speaking, it's biased to the west, to the left-hand side. So the policy of 2 London mayors and several sort of governments is to do this. Very simply spread the purple. It's that simple, right? And if you think of this at a national level, at a regional level, at a city level, that's basically the policy which has shaped this man and his predecessors' idea of go east. And that's what's happening. Why go east? There's lots of land still today because of our industrial history, not unlike Detroit. And there have been a series of 3 absolutely major investments in public transport which have ended up with a result which, frankly, we haven't expected to come so quickly, and that's what I will end on. Crossrail is a high-speed rail that goes all the way from, in fact, Heathrow Airport, West London, and beyond West London, then goes in a tunnel underground. I'm sure there's a lot of LafargeHolcim concrete there, and then goes all the way up here. You remember that these areas here, on the east of London, that's roughly the central axis, are the most deprived. There are the 2 actually overlaid. There's the line going over sort of the more deprived areas that you see. This is being built with very substantial public support, $25 billion in fact, and it's already seen to be a successful model in bringing jobs and providing opportunities for residences, that a new plan for a Crossrail 2 going from the northeast to the southwest of London is being conceived and is being planned for 2030. We've already implemented a scheme which effectively connects London in a sort of orbital way, which has seen a lot of new housing and a lot of development happen. And let me end with the East London story. All of you know about Canary Wharf. It's not my favorite place, but it's created 100,000 new jobs in London since it was built. What is interesting is that as a result of the Crossrail development right over here, there is a new station. There it is, as it happens by Foster, but that's not the point. And what has been the effect of that? And this is where infrastructure and planning actually come together. The effect has been that on a site like this, right next to this development, where nothing has happened for years, planning permission has been allowed for that, with 8,000 new residences, of which 25% is affordable, and obviously more jobs. That's the Herzog de Meuron scheme as part of the development. And let me end with the Olympics. I don't need to describe the project. This is what the site used to be like. This is what it's going to end up looking like, hopefully. The whole idea was to create something that was closed to actually be part of a much more integrated part of London. And the political language that was used in 2012, or before 2012, was this notion of convergence. And I think that infrastructure has an enormous amount to do with this notion of social convergence. The idea was that wherever you're born in London, in the next 20 years, you will have the same life chances. And I think that's the connection which one wants to make. The master plan has evolved. many new bridges and connections were made. There's housing, there's a velodrome, there's jobs, there's our dear friend and now late friend Zaha Hadid's fantastic swimming pool, which is used by 1 million people already in its first year. Their parks and their new institutions like the V&A, the Smithsonian, and others coming to this area. But fundamentally, you can even see here that the cultural buildings are explained or justified in terms of the jobs they will bring to this area. Now, if you look at this map, even though you can't see the figures, we're talking about already 300,000 new jobs actually created in this area in the last decade. Research which has come out literally last week, that's why I was saying, and this is where I will end, which actually surprised many of us involved in this project, is that the number of jobs and the economy of East London has changed so dramatically that in blue you can see where the new jobs have been created. But in this very hurried map that I produced yesterday, if you take the 5 boroughs, the sort of 5 districts, some of the poorest districts in London and some of the poorest districts in the whole of the UK, the London boroughs of Newham, Tower Hamlets, Hackney, and Waltham Forest, known as the Olympic boroughs because that's where the Olympic site was built. The statistics that came out last week show that in Hackney and in Newham, these 2 different boroughs, Newham used to be, in 2010, so I'm talking about 5 years ago, the 14th most deprived in the UK, or had the greatest concentration of deprivation in the UK, 14th. And now it's gone down to 104th. And in Hackney, which was the 6th most deprived in the UK in 2010, is now the 50th. This, for me, was the tangible evidence that infrastructure, plus many other things, schools, health, investment in social welfare, supporting families and affordable housing, not by itself, but infrastructure can be a very positive force for the good and a force for social integration. Thank you very much.